This segment, we're going to talk about the beginning of Main Street USA and where to come from, how to get started. Remember in the segment when you visited my home studio in my library office where I have the case, I talked about the landscape pieces that were really important to me. And these come from about 1994. So these were the early pieces that began me thinking about background landscapes. So as I explored this, and this is over from about 1998, say, up through 2001, I went from this into the storytime pieces, and you can see there's more landscape in this. And these pieces were really important in me looking not at the figures of the characters, which is what a lot of artists do when they look at Disney. I started to look at the films and say, wow, look at those backgrounds. And this is why I like Pixar's work so much, is I love the backgrounds in the films. And of course, I love the original Disney films prior to Pixar. But, you look at these films over, I've been doing Disney art since 1985, and you spend these years looking at the films and you start to look at the backgrounds. So this landscape in the island of Peter Pan, Neverland, and then take a look at this Dumbo piece, just flying over this and seeing if I could force a perspective back. So, what happened? I was doing a show with Storytime. I was at the Disney convention, and at that convention we had released this piece, the Steamboat Willie piece, and this is this piece had a lot of influence on my career. And I met Deanne Hill there, and she introduced herself to me and asked if I would be interested in working on the Main Street USA for Disneyland's 50th. And I said, yeah, sure. So this was a pivotal point for me. So what happened is, now this is August 30th, 2008. And the first intro for the Disneyland Main Street piece was the castle. And I started working on that in 2001. So I was, 56 years old when I started this program. And of course, come on around and look at this. You look at this now and you say, well, of course, this is the way it should look. But at that time, this was a big mystery to me. Now, I was not an architectural modeler. And, I've been to Disneyland, but, since 2001, of course, I go down to Disneyland, 10 times a year, maybe more. And so I just want to share with you, we're going to go through these papers. Come on over and take a look at this. When you take on something like this, here we were committed to doing Disneyland Main Street. And what I really liked about it was Disney sent us a strong message that they would finish the Main Street. So that was the agreement that we made together. So one of the things I really had to consider was if I was going to do Main Street, I had to consider the train, the scale. So in this first castle piece, this was by far the hardest one to do. And the reason was we had to solve the scale. So that meant that I had to go to train shows, all these model train shops, and lay out the big map for Disneyland, of course, which is the one that you see on the wall over my shoulder, and figure out how the castle would fit in there. And of course, it's pencil, so it's going to be hard to read from that distance. But so the first thing was the layout. Of course, the castle sitting here. And could I take this large tract of land and condense it down into something that was 30 by 6 feet, 30 inches by 72 inches. So that was the first problem. And I had to get the park in my mind, just get it in my mind. So I went back and forth between doing this in Z scale and N scale. So that was the first consideration. Then you start to look at this, and at the time, here's a layout of the footprint of the castle footprint, and you can see all the curves in this. And if I were to do this today, 2008, when I did this piece, it's lovely when you see the piece, But all these curves really became a problem in shrinkage and how they would fit to this base and how they would marry into the other pieces. I would have really done this with a straight edge here maybe, and a straight edge here, and then a sharp edge here. And you can see that happen in the other pieces, because all these curves in that end up being a problem when they reduce in the models. The other thing I had to consider was room in here for the batteries. Until this time, you know, people, when they cast the castles, whether it be Cinderella's castle out of Disney World or the Sleeping Beauty's castle, you never cut through the center of the castle. They were always solid. And I looked at all the work of Lilliput Lane, the work of Ray Day, and of course you can see that goes the whole way through. So that was another consideration. This little model that you're looking at, we also had to address not only how it was going to fit together, but the lighting mechanisms. The lighting mechanisms, here's a package just on the street lamps. And we had to look and say, you know, just what was the diameter of that little neck on that street lamp? And could we fish the lights up through there? And we spent a whole block of time just investigating the kinds of little tiny lights that we could get up there. We tried so hard to put LEDs up in there, but at the time the technology for LEDs just didn't allow us to do that, unless there was something that I missed. But we had an LED lighting expert that we used as a consultant. We had a Z-gauge consultant for trains. We finally settled on N-gauge for the train and a mix. And then the other big problem was the base. And you think, well, of course not. You look at it. When we did this base, the big influence for the bases is, if you look at this, I had really considered at the time that, and the reason I have this piece out here, remember we had